Before I left for my holiday break, universities in my area were pretty set on going back to normal and leaving the virtual classroom behind. Now, I've done all my degrees in math or physics, so this seemed to mean that we would go back to the typical 1 hour lectures a few times a week format. This is usually accompanied by a professor who is often teaching the course as a requirement and would rather be doing research or perhaps teaching a graduate course. This would then be combined with hopefully well-typed course notes or handwritten notes that the professor uses to give the lecture. Sometimes these notes are self-contained, and sometimes the professor uses them as sort of bulletin points that are expanded on. Depending on the course, you might also have a relevant textbook that follows the material closely. But as you get into more senior classes, you end up getting recommended perhaps multiple books that the professor might be pulling from, so it's difficult to learn the material independently. You also have a handful of tests, exams, and homework assignments. So to me, this is what the status quo is: classes with inconsistent resources and supports that are therefore inconsistently accessible. Today, I'm making this video to convince you that we can do better. I propose it's time to rethink the way we approach these topics and help students learn. And I want to do this from my personal perspective and share my own experiences with inaccessibility in physics. You may feel like the status quo I described above is just the way it's done. So in order to make things clear, let's start talking about disability and ableism. So let's begin by introducing two models of disability. Before I get started, I just want to say that there are plenty of great videos on YouTube about this topic, so I'll leave a link to a few resources in the description. The first model is the medical model of disability. The medical model essentially links a diagnosis of disability to a person's individual body and seeks to improve their quality of life through medical intervention, either partially or fully. The medical model treats a disability as an illness that needs to be cured or overcome in order for a person to participate. Now, this makes sense. If someone has an impairment, their quality of life can sometimes be improved, either partially or fully, through medical intervention. But in the case of partial improvement, this idea leaves a lot to be desired. Our hypothetical person with an impairment still experiences their disability while they interact with society. The medical model of disability commits itself to the fact that these disability barriers exist in the first place. Disabling barriers are taken as axioms, and medical intervention is intended to make a person fit previously existing societal conditions that wouldn't necessarily exist if disabled people had a say in the first place. From here, we then usually put all of the responsibility on the person with the disability to seek out accommodations, to overcome disabling barriers present in society, or in our more narrow discussion, in the education system. Now, there are a few problems with distributing all or most of the responsibility of removing barriers to individual persons. Firstly, when seeking out accommodations, regardless of the context, you are often made to feel as if you are requesting special treatment. You feel like maybe you don't deserve help, or you don't know what accommodations are appropriate or what the institution will even say yes to. And those feelings are difficult, and it's difficult to self-advocate in this way. Self-advocacy can become a significant barrier for people with a variety of different disabilities. And on top of this, the person there to help you will often turn you down or tell you there isn't money for a specific accommodation, or they might even be unsure of how to help you or how the institution can accommodate you. Second, this can lead to hostile accommodations that appear as if they are helpful, but for the disabled person, it can only marginally improve their situation or perhaps not at all. The accommodations can just create more barriers. This often doesn't occur to people, but accommodations regularly just replace one barrier with another. So this, to me, as I've described it, is also the status quo. This is how we usually deal with barriers in large institutions like universities. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are plenty of people who are perfectly happy with how school life functions, even individuals with impairments, that the universities were able to accommodate properly. But this definitely isn't everyone. So let's change our mindset here a bit and introduce a different way to think about disability. The social model of disability distinguishes the word impairment and disability. Impairment is the attribute that affects a person. The social model tells us that although a person can have an impairment, it's actually through their interaction with society that they experience disability. That is, it is society that disables the person with the impairment. If a person is unable to climb stairs, the medical model will focus on making the person physically capable of climbing stairs, thus putting the responsibility on the person. The social model, on the other hand, would focus on making stair climbing unnecessary, removing the disabling staircase. This could be replacing stairs with wheelchair accessible ramps, and inside having accessible elevators. Once the barriers of the stairs are removed, the person is of course still impaired, but the impairment is no longer disabling, since the places they need to access are now accessible. So this way of thinking has a number of implications. Firstly, we should be working in education and of course other areas to removing disabling barriers that people face. We should be careful about providing hostile accommodations or accommodations that simply place a new barrier in place of an old one. But my second point that I'm going to make is maybe a bit more controversial, and it is that with how diverse impairments can be, the current way we approach education is insufficient to actually give quality education regardless of impairment. The current status quo structure is forced to give hostile accommodations and fundamentally disadvantages people. To make this point, I think a few lived experiences are needed to drive the point home more clearly. I am disabled. I've never said this before on the channel, but I have chronic migraines. So what does this mean? In a given period of time, I will experience migraines significantly more than half of that time. A migraine is a neurological disorder that has 4 distinct phases. The first is the so-called premonitory phase, which can start up to 72 hours before any pain in the head begins. For me, this amounts to light sensitivity, fatigue, food cravings, and sometimes my neck gets really stiff. The light sensitivity and fatigue are quite impairing, and I'll get back to that later. When this stage is ongoing, I'm usually quite aware of it, and know that overexertion or going into a bright environment will lead to a much worse migraine than if I just stay home, rest, and stay in a semi-dark environment. This is actually one of the reasons the videos tend to not be well lit. My migraines can be triggered or worsened with too much light. The list of possible triggers isn't really limited to these stimuli either. Things like emotional stress, missing food or sleep, eating certain foods, weather, odors, smoke, alcohol, and even exercise can trigger my migraines. Some of these things are in my control, some of them are completely out of the control of human beings, and some of them are in the control of the people and institutions I interact with. Now, while I'm in this stage, things I just listed preferably would be cut off, as exposing myself to them results in significantly worse outcomes during the pain stage of the migraine. The next stage people have is the aura stage. I don't have visual aura, but I often have more difficulty than usual communicating. The headache phase is the third phase of the migraine. My symptoms can vary during the migraine, but aside from the pain I am in, I can also be light, odor, and sound sensitive. Sometimes I also get nauseous. Moving can cause more pain than just sitting still, and this pain can last a very long time. I've had weeks or longer where I've experienced pain and have been mostly immobilized. The final stage of migraines is the postrum phase, which is often lingering symptoms from a migraine. I regularly experience pain from moving even if I don't have it while I'm at rest. I also get very fatigued, experience brain fog, and have a few other symptoms. I have so many migraines at this point in my life that it's sometimes difficult to pinpoint which stage of a migraine I'm actually in. Now, as you might imagine, having these symptoms, this impairment, can make a lot of everyday life quite disabling. Before we jump into stories, I just want to say yes, I am being treated for this. I have prescriptions to help me with my pain, and I regularly see a neurologist. Okay, so let's start with some lived experiences to sort of communicate the barriers I faced as an undergraduate student and as a graduate student. The first barrier that I experienced throughout taking classes was with attendance. It's probably obvious from my description that attending class just isn't in the cards sometimes. Now, for some courses, this wasn't that big of an issue. Professors who teach from good, comprehensive custom notes or who follow a textbook closely allowed me to follow closely at home, where I could manage my symptoms better. This, however, isn't always the case. Attendance is crucial for some lecturers. Their notes aren't that readable or complete, they regularly diverge from them, or perhaps they are lecturing from several textbooks. For me, this then makes it hard to follow the course. I also ran into situations where professors would be upset that people would miss class, and to empower regularly attending students, they'd work out examples on the board and later put those examples on the exam. Or they would more or less summarize what to expect on the exam in person. Now, this took time to get used to get reliable friends, to communicate what I missed, but I think we can all agree that this is an unneeded barrier. With modern technology, it would be relatively easy to record or even stream every lecture, whether they were in person or not. It's also probably easy to see that empowering people who attend class in this context gives an advantage to those people who do not have impairments that prevent them from regularly attending class. Now, missing days doesn't just affect lectures, it also affects exams, and even handing in material. I've had professors insist that things needed to be handed in person. So regularly I would, with migraine symptoms, sometimes in extreme pain, bus into campus to hand in an assignment. In my first year and a half, you guessed it, I also took exams with migraines. I would simply medicate heavily to try and complete these tasks. So the outcomes of my exams were mostly tied to my migraine symptoms and not my preparation. This happened to be very hard on my grades and on my stomach. I now take stomach medication every day to counter the effects of that period of my life. For exams, eventually I talked to academic counseling about it, and they said, no problem, just give us a doctor's note. They weren't specific about when, and I was terrified of not getting accommodated, so I would regularly, with symptoms, go to my doctors for a note. At times, I would be busing to my doctor's office with a lot of pain, paying them money each time to get a doctor's note to prove again and again to the university that I was in fact a person with migraines. I was told the reason for this was because other people lied about having migraines to get out of tests and exams. But this barrier just made my episodes worse, made them longer, and overall gave me a sense that the institution I was paying money to teach me was skeptical of my disability. To try and fix this particular problem, I went to disability services twice. The first time, I didn't really know what to expect and sort of awkwardly sat there with the counselor discussing my disability and experience. The resulting offer ended up being that they'd offer me a quiet, dark place to take my exam. This was an okay solution, but it didn't change the fact that I had to travel to this place in environments that made my symptoms worse to get there. I would still need a doctor's note to cancel, and I wouldn't have access to someone knowledgeable to answer questions about the exams. The solution barely improved my situation and gave me a new disadvantage. The second time I went, I was more insistent on needing more schedule flexibility and was told flat out that university was in person and I couldn't be accommodated. They instead sent a note to my professors saying that I might be late, absent, or need extra time with homework, and they should help me at their own discretion. So in conclusion, they more or less did nothing. Professors had the right to say no to me and to not accommodate me. All of this together, university is a crowded, bright, loud, smelly place to someone like me. Campuses are also incredibly large. Despite the physics and math buildings being quite close to each other, I, for some reason, regularly had classes scheduled across the campuses in unrelated buildings. To make things even better, these classes could be 10 minutes apart in time and a 10-minute fast walk for an able-bodied person. So I'd regularly need to walk slow to manage my pain and show up late to a class that could have been in the buildings associated with the subjects. These are just a few things. There is plenty more to mention, including discriminatory attitudes and little things that just make the experience more difficult. But hopefully these stories and examples have shown you why, despite being progressive institutions, universities regularly fail to meet the needs of disabled students, or provide them with hostile accommodations that don't meet the students' needs. So I'll leave you with some questions. After hearing this and hopefully understanding that I am one person with one impairment, and understanding the diversity of different issues and barriers people face in the current status quo education model, do you really think that we should be teaching physics, mathematics, or any subject the way we do? Should we be testing the way we do? Is this even the most efficient way to help those who don't face barriers? Could we not think of a better model? Who is benefited by this model of education? Let me know what you think in the comment section, but personally I think it's exciting to imagine a system that would improve everyone's experiences while eliminating a number of unnecessary barriers. So thanks for watching. If you liked the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below.